The fluorescent lights of Northwood High hummed their usual monotonous tune, a soundtrack to Ethan's Saturday detention. He was supposed to be organizing the forgotten relics in the dusty storage closet off the main gymnasium, a punishment for a misplaced science experiment involving baking soda and a lot more vinegar than anticipated. Mr. Henderson, the janitor on duty, had grudgingly handed him a broom and a weary sigh. "Just try not to break anything else, kid." Ethan, perpetually clumsy, had taken that as a personal challenge. He wrestled with a towering metal cabinet filled with ancient gym equipment, the kind that looked like it belonged in a medieval torture museum. It groaned in protest, inching away from the wall. With a final shove, the cabinet tipped, not just to the floor, but sideways against the wall. A sickening crunch echoed through the otherwise silent room. Dust billowed, obscuring the damage. Ethan coughed, waving a hazy hand. That's when he saw it. Where the cabinet had stood, a section of the cinder block wall was different. It was darker, smoother, and there, flush with the surface, was the unmistakable outline of a door. It had no handle, no hinges visible, just a perfect, unsettling rectangle. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. This was Turlock, California, a town where nothing much ever happened. Old buildings had quirks, sure, but a hidden door in a school storage closet, that was something straight out of one of his brother's spooky graphic novels. He cautiously reached out, his fingers brushing against the rough, unyielding surface. It felt ancient, out of place. He pushed. Nothing. He leaned his shoulder into it, expecting resistance. Instead, the door slid inward with a faint, dry whisper, like turning the pages of a very old book. He peered into the darkness, a musty, forgotten scent wafting out. It smelled of chalk dust and something else, something coppery and faint, like old pennies. His detention boredom had vanished, replaced by a potent cocktail of fear and an insatiable curiosity that had always gotten him into trouble. This was definitely more interesting than alphabetizing defunct cheerleading uniforms. He stepped through the opening into a space that felt impossibly small and vast at the same time. The air grew noticeably colder. Inside, the glow of the gymnasium lights barely penetrated. It was a classroom, but unlike any Ethan had ever seen. Rows of dark wooden desks, scarred with generations of carvings, faced a tall, dusty chalkboard. The walls were bare, save for faded outlines where perhaps old posters once hung. A single, bare bulb flickered overhead, casting long, dancing shadows. It felt like stepping back in time to a place meant to be forgotten. He took another step, the heavy door swinging shut behind him with a soft, decisive click that sent a shiver down his spine, though he tried to dismiss it. He was just supposed to be cleaning. The silence of the hidden classroom pressed in on Ethan, thick and suffocating. The air was heavy with a stillness that felt unnatural for a school, even an empty one. The single light bulb above buzzed erratically, its weak glow barely pushing back the encroaching shadows in the corners. He ran his hand along one of the wooden desks. The surface was surprisingly smooth beneath the dust, the wood old and polished by countless elbows and restless hands. He traced a deeply etched initial, something that looked like a J, intertwined with a faint W. Who sat here, and when? He turned back to the door he'd entered through. He'd expected it to be partially ajar, letting in some of the gym's dim light. Instead, it was shut tight, a seamless part of the wall. He reached for where he thought the handle should be, his fingers finding only smooth, painted wood. He pushed again, harder this time, a flicker of unease creeping in. It wouldn't budge. It was locked or sealed from the outside. How? He hadn't heard a lock turn. Mr. Henderson was on the other side of the gym, probably watching reruns of MASH in his office. A gust of frigid air swept through the room, raising goosebumps on Ethan's arms. It was far colder than it should have been, a chill that seeped into his bones. This wasn't just a draft. It felt like standing in a walk-in freezer, a palpable cold that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the classroom. He held his breath, listening. Had he imagined it? No, the air was definitely frigid, carrying that same strange, coppery scent from before, only stronger now. He looked around frantically. Were there any windows? No, just 4 solid walls and the single flickering bulb. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched. He spun around, his eyes darting to the darkened corners, then to the dusty blackboard. The chalk dust was so thick it was almost like a veil, smudging everything. He could see faint impressions on the board, as if someone had recently written something and then wiped it away in a frenzy. What was written there? He wanted to get closer, but the intensified cold seemed to push him back, a silent warning. Stepping away from the locked door, he began to explore the small space more thoroughly, his footsteps unnervingly loud on the wooden floor. He ran his hand along the cool walls, searching for any sign of an exit, any clue to what this place was. His fingers brushed against something rough and metallic near the base of the blackboard. It was a small tarnished plaque, almost completely obscured by dust. He scraped away the grime, revealing faded lettering that made his stomach clench. Northwood High, Room 4B. But there was no Room 4B on any school map he'd ever seen. Ethan stared at the tarnished plaque. Northwood High, Room 4B, etched into its surface. It made no sense. He'd gone to Northwood High his entire life, and he'd never encountered a Room 4B. The numbering system was straightforward. Classrooms were on the first floor, 100s block, and the science labs were on the second, 200s block. Maybe it was an old designation, something removed from the blueprints years ago. But then, how was the door still there, hidden behind a cabinet? He turned back to the door, his mind racing. If this was a classroom, it had to have a way in and out. He examined the seam where the door met the wall, looking for a hidden latch or a pressure plate. Nothing. He kicked at the base of the door, the sound echoing hollowly, but it remained resolutely shut. The cold air still swirled around him, a constant, unnerving presence. He shivered, pulling his thin detention hoodie tighter around himself. This entire situation felt like a bizarre dream he couldn't wake up from. He approached the blackboard again, drawn by the cryptic smudges. He wished he had some water, or even a dirty rag, to clean it off. But all he had were his hands, coated in gym dust. He rubbed at the smudges with his sleeve, revealing more distinct writing. It was a math problem, an algebra equation that looked familiar, yet somehow off. The x and y variables were present, but the numbers seemed archaic, as if chosen from a different era. And then he saw it, nestled in the corner of the board, written in impossibly neat, old-fashioned cursive. Ethan Miller. His breath hitched. His name written on the board. But how? He was the only one in this classroom, the only one who had walked through this hidden door. The chalk dust still clung to the board, making it impossible for anyone to have written it recently. He felt a tremor run through his hands. This was more than just a forgotten room. It was a room that knew him. He pulled his hands away from the board as if it had burned him. The cold intensified, and he could have sworn he heard a faint rustling sound, like brittle paper being shuffled. He backed away from the blackboard, his eyes falling on the desks again. He noticed that each desk was different, older than the last, as he moved further into the room. The ones near the door were relatively intact, but those closer to the blackboard were show more wear, more carvings, some with ink stains that looked centuries old. He knelt beside the nearest desk to the board, his fingers tracing the faint etchings. He saw dates: 1948, 1952, 1939. These weren't just old desks. They suggested a classroom that had been in use for a long, long time. A very long time. The date etched into the desk, 1952, felt impossibly distant to Ethan. He was supposed to be clearing out old basketballs and deflated volleyballs, not exploring a historical anomaly tucked away in the Turlock High School building itself. The cold in room 4B seemed to deepen with every passing minute. A visceral chill that had nothing to do with drafts, and everything to do with the unnerving stillness of the place. He stood up, his gaze sweeping across the room again, landing on a small rickety shelf attached to the wall near the blackboard. It was laden with books, their spines uniformly aged and dusty. He approached the shelf with a mixture of dread and compulsion. What kind of books would be in a classroom like this? He reached for the nearest one, its cover a faded, nondescript brown. The title, printed in gold lettering that had partially flaked away, read, Advanced Calculus, the Geometry of Space. Ethan blinked. Advanced Calculus? In a high school classroom? that was college level stuff, and certainly not something he'd ever seen in the Northwood High curriculum. He pulled the book from the shelf, its pages brittle in his hands. The paper felt rough, almost like parchment. He flipped through it, the equations and diagrams a bewildering jumble. It looked legitimate, as if it had been used, studied from, but it was utterly irrelevant to anything he had ever encountered in his high school education. He picked up another book. This one was titled The Principles of Aerodynamics, Beyond Mach 1. Again, college level, and, more importantly, not a subject offered at Northwood. He continued down the shelf, each book a testament to a curriculum far beyond his own. There were titles on obscure historical events, advanced physics concepts, and even a volume on celestial navigation. He felt a growing sense of confusion, mixed with a creeping unease. This wasn't just an old classroom. It was a repository of knowledge that seemed to exist outside of his reality. He grabbed another book, its cover a deep maroon. The History of the Turlock Irrigation District, 1888 to 1925. That one at least had a local connection, but the dates were incredibly specific and oddly early for a textbook. He opened it, and his eyes fell on a chapter heading, The Great Flood of 23, a near miss. He'd never heard of a significant flood in Turlock in 1923. Then he picked up a slim arithmetic primer. Its title was simply Basic Operations for Level 1. He opened it, expecting simple addition and subtraction. Instead, the first page showed a complex diagram of atomic structure and a problem involving quantum entanglement. It was as if the very concept of basic had been redefined within these walls. He closed the book with a thud, the sound deadening in the oddly muffled air of the room. These weren't just the wrong subjects. They were impossible subjects. The sheer absurdity of the books weighed on Ethan. Advanced calculus, aerodynamics, atomic structures. These were not topics covered in Mr. Henderson's introductory science classes. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. His mind struggled to grasp the disconnect. It was like finding a physics textbook in a kindergarten classroom. He placed the arithmetic primer back on the shelf, his hands trembling slightly. The cold in the room seemed to emanate from these books, from the very air they occupied. He took a few steps back, scanning the entire room again. He needed to find a way out, and fast. The earlier excitement had curdled into something akin to panic. The door was still sealed. The blackboard still bore his name. And these bizarre textbooks continued to mock his understanding of education. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe this was some kind of experimental wing, a forgotten annex for gifted students from decades past. But even then, the subjects seemed too advanced, too esoteric, and the cold, the constant, bone-deep cold. Suddenly, he heard it, a faint, almost inaudible sound, like dry leaves skittering across a dusty floor, or the rustle of old paper. It seemed to come from the far corner of the room, near the wall opposite the blackboard. Ethan froze, straining his ears. He held his breath, listening intently. Was it the building settling? A rat in the walls? No. It was more distinct than that. It was a whisper. A low, drawn-out whisper. A single syllable that he couldn't quite make out. He slowly turned his head, his eyes fixed on the corner. There was nothing there but shadows and the thick layer of dust. He took a hesitant step towards it, then another. As he moved, the whispering stopped. He reached the corner, his hand outstretched, feeling the rough cinder block walls. Nothing. No opening. No vent. No sign of anything that could have made the sound. He strained to hear it again, but the silence was absolute, pressing in on him. Then, as he turned back towards the center of the room, he heard it again, closer this time, right beside his ear. It was a drawn-out, sibilant sound, an almost inaudible exhale of air. Ethan yelped, leaping away, spinning around wildly. His heart thudded against his ribs like a trapped bird. There was no one there. Absolutely no one. The room was empty, save for him and the desks and the impossible books. He backed away from where the whisper had originated, his eyes wide, scanning the shadows with a prickle of genuine fear. This room wasn't just strange. It was actively trying to get his attention. The whisper, so close, so personal, had sent a jolt of pure terror through Ethan. He backed away from the corner, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. It couldn't have been his imagination. The cold, the books, his name on the board. It was all too much. He needed to get out. He rushed back to the door, slamming his fist against the wall where the handle should be. "Let me out!" he yelled, his voice hoarse and cracked. The solid wood remained unyielding, offering no hint of release. He sank onto one of the wooden desks, his head in his hands. He felt a growing dread, an understanding that this was something far beyond a simple prank or a quirky old room. He looked at the shelves of books again. The wrong subjects suddenly felt like a deliberate misdirection, a way to make him doubt his own perception of reality. His name on the board felt like a claim. His gaze drifted to a small, leather-bound book lying on the shelf, separate from the others. It was thicker, more like a journal or an album. Curiosity, a dangerous companion, drew him to it. He picked it up, the leather cool and dry beneath his fingers. It was old, the corners worn smooth. He opened it, and his breath caught. It was a yearbook, but not a yearbook from Northwood High. The crest on the cover was unfamiliar. A stylized owl with a single, crossed quill pen beneath it. He flipped through the brittle pages, his eyes scanning the posed photographs. Young faces, dressed in clothing that screamed mid-20th century, stared back at him. Graduation years were printed below the photos. 1950, 1951, 1952, 1953. These were the students who had sat at these desks. Then, he noticed something peculiar. For many of the graduating classes, there were gaps. Spaces where a student's picture should have been. But instead, there was just a blank square, sometimes with a faint, smudged outline. It was as if some of the students had been erased, or perhaps never existed in the first place. He flipped further into a section labeled In Memoriam. Here, he found more blank spaces, but this time they were accompanied by names. Names he vaguely recognized from old local newspapers, families from Turlock who had stories of long-lost children. As he turned another page, his finger brushed against a small, tucked-away section at the back. It was a class photo, specifically for a class designated as Class of 1952, Advanced Studies. And there, at the front, were rows of students. But as Ethan scanned their faces, a cold dread washed over him. He didn't recognize anyone. Then he looked at the names printed below the photo. His stomach dropped. One name, written in that same neat, old-fashioned cursive that was on the blackboard, jumped out at him. Ethan D. Miller. But the photo was clearly of students from the 1950s. And beneath that name, in slightly smaller print, was a date. Died May 14, 1952. Ethan stared at the yearbook photograph. The name Ethan D. Miller staring back at him. Dated 1952. His own full name. But the face in the photo was not his. It was a young man from another era, his features blurred by the passage of time and the poor quality of the printing. His own name in that peculiar cursive beneath a date of death from over 70 years ago in a class that didn't exist. He slammed the yearbook shut, the sound sharp and unnerving in the oppressive quiet. The cold in the room seemed to sharpen, biting at his skin. He couldn't breathe. This was too much. He was hallucinating. Or maybe this was some kind of elaborate prank. But the cold was too real. The dust too thick. The books too tangible. He scrambled away from the desk, his eyes darting around room 4B as if searching for another exit. He needed air. He needed sunlight. He needed normalcy. He ran to the door again, pressing his ear against the wood. Nothing. Not a sound from the gym.
Mr. Henderson must have gone home. He paced the small room, his mind a whirlwind of impossible questions. How could his name be in the yearbook? Was it a coincidence? A shared name, an unfortunate one. but the handwriting on the board, the handwriting in the yearbook, it was too specific. And the code, that penetrating code that felt like a graveyard's embrace. He looked at the shelves of unnerving books again, as if expecting them to offer an explanation. They remained silent, stoic sentinels of forgotten knowledge. He was trapped in what felt like a temporal anomaly, a pocket of history that refused to stay buried. He had to tell someone. He had to get out and find Mr. Henderson, or the principal, or anyone. He needed to expose this room. He pushed against the door again, futilely. Then a thought struck him. If this room was hidden, maybe it wasn't always in the storage closet. Maybe it moved. It was a wild, desperate idea, born of sheer panic. He turned his back on the door and walked towards the wall opposite the blackboard, the wall he hadn't really examined closely yet. He ran his hands along the rough cinder blocks, searching for anything unusual. As his fingers moved, he felt a slight indentation, a subtle shift in the texture. He pushed, and to his astonishment, the section of wall gave way, sliding inward with that same dry, papery whisper he'd heard before. He stumbled through the opening, gasping for fresh air. He wasn't in the gym storage closet anymore. He was in the Northwood High Library, tucked away in a secluded alcove behind the historical fiction section. The familiar scent of old paper and polish filled his nostrils. The warm glow of the library lights was a blessed relief after the suffocating darkness of room 4B. But as he turned back, he saw the faint, rectangular outline of the doorway, now seamlessly integrated into the library wall, the books on the shelves undisturbed. The door was shut, and the air suddenly felt much, much colder. The sudden transition from the bone-chilling cold of room 4B to the normalcy of the Turlock High Library was disorienting, to say the least. Ethan stumbled backward, landing on the plush carpet, his heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked from the wall where the door had vanished, back into the library shelves, then to the faint seam it had left behind. It was as if the entire hidden classroom had simply relocated. This wasn't just a strange room. It was a mobile anomaly. He frantically looked around. The library was empty, save for the librarian, Mrs. Gable, who was engrossed in shelving books at the far end of the main aisle. her back to him. He was safe. For now. He took deep, shaky breaths, trying to regain his composure. He had to get out of the library quickly before anyone saw him emerging from a wall. He pushed himself to his feet, his eyes still scanning the now invisible doorway. The cold lingered, a faint whisper on his skin, but the oppressive chill of the classroom itself had thankfully dissipated. He stood there for a moment, trying to piece together what was happening. The yearbook, his name, the impossible books, the shifting door. It was all too much to comprehend. This was beyond any urban legend or ghost story he'd ever heard. He felt a desperate urge to confide in someone. But who would believe him? He'd sound insane. Yeah, Mr. Henderson. There's this classroom that moves and has books on alien physics. He decided his best bet was to get back to his car, go home, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But as he turned to leave the alcove, his eyes fell upon a small, worn, wooden table sitting beside the wall, bathed in the dim light filtering through the shelves. On the table sat a single, yellowed piece of paper. It looked like a test. And in the corner, written in that same precise, unsettling cursive, were the words, Ethan Miller. His blood ran cold. He cautiously approached the table. This was it, another manifestation. He cautiously picked up the paper. It was a quiz, titled, The Fundamentals of Temporal Mechanics. The questions were a blur of theoretical paradoxes and advanced physics concepts, completely incomprehensible to him. But at the very bottom, beneath a series of blank lines for answers, was a single typed instruction: complete and return to instructor. He stared at it, his mind reeling. He knew he shouldn't touch it, shouldn't engage with it, but the compulsion was overwhelming. He found himself picking up a nearby pencil, his hand moving almost of its own accord. He didn't know the answers, not a single one. He fumbled through the questions, doodling random symbols, writing nonsensical phrases, anything to fill the space. He didn't have a clue what he was doing. Then, as he finished scrawling his name at the bottom, the pencil in his hand began to glow with a faint, ethereal light. Before his eyes, the ink on the paper began to fade. The questions, his own scribbled answers, his name. It all dissolved, turning into a faint wisp of smoke that vanished into the air within seconds. The paper was completely blank, as if it had never been written on. All that remained was the faint scent of ozone and the chilling realization that this room knew how to play its tricks. Ethan stared at the blank piece of paper on the table, the faint scent of ozone tickling his nostrils. The test had vanished before his eyes, leaving him with only the lingering chill and the growing certainty that he was in over his head. The library was still his refuge, but the warmth of its familiarity now felt tainted by the recent intrusion. He glanced at his watch. Detention was long over. Mr. Henderson would have locked up by now. He was truly alone with this impossible secret. He decided his only course of action was to try and find official documentation. If this room truly existed, hidden and unknown, surely there had to be some record of it somewhere. He needed proof. He remembered seeing architectural blueprints of the school displayed in the main administrative office during a freshman orientation tour. Maybe that was his best bet. He slipped out of the library alcove, trying to appear casual as he walked past Mrs. Gable, who didn't even glance up from her work. The administrative office was deserted, the lights still on, casting long shadows across the empty desks. He bypassed the principal's office, hoping to avoid any direct confrontation, and instead headed for the filing cabinets near the secretary's desk. He began to pull out drawers marked building plans, renovations, and historical records. His hands trembled as he sifted through stacks of yellowed paper, each blueprint a potential key. He was looking for any anomaly, any unused space, any sealed-off room. He spent what felt like an eternity poring over the intricate drawings of Northwood High, tracing the corridors and classrooms. He found sections marked for demolition, areas that had been repurposed, but nothing that remotely resembled the hidden classroom. He even found old plans that showed a different layout for the gymnasium area from decades ago. But still, no trace of room 4B or any other annex that could explain his discovery. Frustration gnawed at him. He was about to give up when he spotted a small, overlooked section on one of the older blueprints labeled Storage Annex, Original Construction. It was a small, cramped space adjacent to the current gymnasium. He traced the walls of this annex. It was sealed off by several feet of solid wall, as if it had been intentionally bricked up. He then compared this to a newer set of plans showing the current gym layout. The space where the annex should have been was now simply part of the larger gymnasium structure, with nothing indicating an internal division. Could that cramped, forgotten space have been manipulated somehow? He decided to take a chance. He walked into Principal Thompson's office.
Principal Thompson was known for being a stickler for rules, but also for being incredibly knowledgeable about the school's history. Ethan took a deep breath and sat on the edge of the plush visitor's chair. He had to ask somebody. He had to ask the principal. He rehearsed his question, making it sound as innocent as possible. "Principal Thompson," he began, his voice barely a whisper. The principal looked up from his paperwork, his expression neutral. "I was just wondering, for a history project, is there a room 106A? I couldn't find it on the campus map, and I thought maybe it was an older room number." He watched the principal's face closely. Principal Thompson frowned, his brow furrowing. He pulled out a campus map from his desk and scanned it. "Room 106A. No, Ethan. There's no room 106A. Never has been, as far as I know. Our numbering system is quite straightforward." He paused, then added, "Are you sure you have the right number?" Ethan's stomach sank. The principal's definitive denial was crushing. It felt like he was being gaslit by the school itself. Principal Thompson's flat denial of room 106A, or any variation of it, echoed in Ethan's ears as he walked home. It was definitive, confident, and utterly dismissive. It painted Ethan's discovery as a figment of his imagination, a consequence of guilt about detention. Yet, the cold, the books, the yearbook, the self-erasing test, and the shifting door were undeniable realities that clung to him like a shroud. He felt a growing isolation, a burden of knowledge
No one else would understand. He couldn't shake the image of the yearbook, the name Ethan D. Miller from 1952, beside a photo of a boy he didn't know. Those missing faces, those erased students. It gnawed at him. If the school denied the room's existence, perhaps the key wasn't in the architecture, but in the people. Who would know about a hidden, forgotten classroom? Perhaps a very, very old teacher. Someone who had been at Northwood for decades. He remembered seeing an emeritus professor listed on the school's website who sometimes guest lectured. Dr. Eleanor Vance. She was listed as a retired history professor who had taught at Northwood for over 50 years, hailing from a time when the school was a fraction of its current size. She would have been there when room 4B, or whatever it was called then, might have been in use, or perhaps sealed away. He found her contact information, a local landline number, and dialed it, his hand shaking slightly. An elderly voice, frail but clear, answered. He explained haltingly that he was a student working on a local history project and was trying to uncover information about older, lesser-known parts of the school campus. He mentioned the storage closet in the gymnasium and the odd possibility of a sealed-off section. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, Dr. Vance's voice, now tinged with a curious, almost mournful tone, said, "The old gymnasium. Yes. I remember when that wing was first added. There were things in there. Things we didn't understand." Ethan's heart leaped. "Things?" he prompted, leaning closer to the receiver. Dr. Vance sighed, a sound like rustling parchment. A peculiar addition it was. A classroom. Not on any official plans I ever saw. They called it the annex. It was only used for a very short time. The annex, Ethan repeated, his mind racing. It fit. Did you ever go inside? I taught a rather unconventional history of science course there for a semester, she admitted softly. The professor in charge was intensely private. He insisted on meeting only the students he personally selected. Students who showed a particular aptitude for alternative study. She paused, her voice growing weaker. There was one student, a young man who reminded me so much of my own son, lost too soon. His name was Ethan Miller. Ethan's breath hitched. Ethan Miller? In the 1950s? Yes, Dr. Vance confirmed, her voice barely a whisper. But he was never meant to graduate. He was meant to stay. They said he never left the classroom. The line went silent for a moment, then Dr. Vance added, I see his face sometimes, in my dreams, always in that cold room. Dr. Vance's words hung in the air, each syllable a hammer blow to Ethan's already fractured reality. He was meant to stay. Never left the classroom. The implications sent a fresh wave of icy dread through him. He thanked the professor, his voice a choked whisper, and hung up the phone, his hand still trembling. She remembered. A teacher who shouldn't be alive, with memories of a student who shared his name and fate. He felt an urgent need to return to Northwood High. The library, the scene of the disappearing test, felt like the only place that held any answers, or at least the potential for them. He sneaked back into the deserted school, the polished floors echoing his hurried footsteps. He made his way directly to the alcove in the library, his eyes scanning the wall where the door had been. It was still seamlessly integrated. He pressed his hands against the smooth surface, hoping for it to yield. Nothing. He spent the next hour pacing the alcove, running his hands over every inch of the wall, trying to recreate the conditions of his previous entry, but the door remained stubbornly concealed. Frustrated and close to despair, he slumped onto the worn table where he'd found the vanishing test. He looked at the empty space where the paper had been, trying to sense any lingering energy. As he sat there, a small overlooked drawer built into the side of the table, a drawer he hadn't noticed before, caught his eye. He pulled it open. Inside, nestled amongst dust bunnies and what looked like dried, brittle leaves, was a thin, leather-bound ledger. He lifted it out, the leather cool and smooth. It was an old student roster, the pages filled with names written in a neat, old-fashioned script. His curiosity, now a desperate need, compelled him to open it. He flipped through the pages, the names blurring together. Then he saw it. A section labeled Advanced Studies, Session Commencing. The dates were recent, a few weeks ago. He scanned the names listed under that heading. There were only a handful. Sarah Jenkins, Mark Peterson, Emily Chen. Typical Northwood students. But then, he noticed a blank line at the very bottom of the list, strangely separated from the others. And beneath that blank line, scrawled in that unsettlingly familiar cursive, a new name had been added. Ethan Miller. It was as if his own name had been appended to a list of active students, an update to a record that shouldn't even exist. A shiver ran down his spine. This wasn't just a forgotten room. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was actively recruiting. The discovery of his name on the new student roster sent a wave of pure terror through Ethan. He wasn't just an accidental visitor. He was now according to this ledger, a bona fide student of this impossible classroom. The cold in the library alcove intensified, a palpable presence that seemed to wrap around him. He slammed the ledger shut, as if he could contain the burgeoning horror within its pages. His name there, added so recently, felt like a mark. He had to get into the room. He had to confront whatever was happening. Seeing his name, knowing he was now officially enrolled, made the need to understand feel paramount, even above his fear. He pushed himself away from the table, his eyes fixed on the wall where the door had last appeared. He began to press against it, harder than before, frantically searching for the point of entry. He pushed along the seams, trying to find any give, any hidden latch. As he was leaning against a particular spot, almost in despair, he felt a subtle click. His breath hitched. He pushed harder, and the familiar, dry whisper of aged paper filled the air. The doorway shimmered into existence, a rectangle of deep shadow in the familiar library wall. Without a second thought, Ethan plunged through, eager to face whatever awaited him, eager to understand. He landed on the dusty wooden floor of room 4B. The chill immediately enveloping him. He stood up, his eyes darting around, ready for anything. The desks were still there. The blackboard still bore his name in that unnerving script, and the strange collection of advanced textbooks sat on the shelf. But something was different. The air felt heavier, more expectant. He turned back to the doorway, intending to leave it open, to keep a clear escape route. But as he reached out, his hand met solid wall. He pushed harder and harder, his panic rising. The doorway was gone. The seam had vanished, leaving only the rough, unbroken cinder blocks. He was trapped. He pounded on the wall, his fists raw against the unyielding surface. "No! Let me out!" he screamed, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. He spun around, desperate for another way out. He looked at the blackboard, his name seeming to glow faintly in the dim light. He rushed to the shelf of books, pulling them down, searching for any hidden mechanisms. Nothing. He tried to pry the desks apart, to find a trapdoor beneath them. The wood was old, but solid. The cold deepened, seeping into him. A chill that felt more like despair than mere temperature. He was locked in with his own name, a student of a school that didn't exist, in a classroom that had just sealed its doors on him. The sickening realization that he was locked in room 4B fully settled upon Ethan, a heavy blanket of dread. He leaned his forehead against the cold, unyielding wall where the door had been, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His frantic pounding had ceased, replaced by a hollow, internal despair. There was no escape. The room was a prison, and he was its newest inmate. The air was thick with an unseen presence, a palpable anticipation that made his skin crawl. He slowly turned back into the center of the room. The chalk writing, Ethan Miller, on the blackboard seemed to mock him, a permanent inscription. He looked at the rows of desks, each one a testament to a past student, a forgotten lesson. His gaze fell on the shelf of impossibly advanced books. He pulled one down, Advanced Calculus, more out of a desperate need to do something than any hope of understanding. The equations swam before his eyes, meaningless symbols in his panic. Then, a faint light began to emanate from the blackboard. It started as a soft glow, then intensified, illuminating the room with an eerie phosphorescent aura. Ethan shielded his eyes, squinting. The chalk writing of his name began to move, to shift, to reform. It wasn't just writing anymore. It was coalescing, forming into words, a sentence. "Welcome, new student," it read, the letters appearing as if drawn by an invisible hand. Ethan stared, mesmerized and terrified. This was it, the lesson. But who was it for? He hadn't been called yet, hadn't been instructed beyond his name being added to a roster. As the words solidified on the board, a low hum began to fill the room, growing steadily louder. The light from the blackboard pulsed in time with the hum. Ethan felt a strange vibration under his feet, as if the entire classroom was coming to life. He looked around, his eyes wide with apprehension. The desks closest to the blackboard began to subtly shift, almost imperceptibly, as if being nudged into a slightly more defined formation. He felt a tug, a gentle but insistent pull towards the front of the room. towards the blackboard. But it wasn't drawing him in. Instead, it felt like it was preparing for someone else. He saw a faint outline begin to form near one of the desks, like a projection. A shadowy figure slowly materialized, coalescing from the dust and shadows. It was indistinct, yet clearly human-shaped. The figure sat down at the illuminated desk, and the hum reached a crescendo. The light from the blackboard flared, and the figure bowed its head over an invisible book. Ethan watched, frozen, a spectator to a lesson that was clearly not meant for him. He was still locked in, still trapped, but he was no longer the focus. Someone or something else was now engaging with this impossible classroom. The shadowy figure at the desk solidified. A student now, clearly present and attending the lesson. Ethan watched, a silent observer in his own nightmare. The figure, cloaked in a dim luminescence, moved with a fluid grace as it began to interact with the invisible material on its desk. Its head bent in intense concentration. The hum that had filled the room now seemed to emanate from this new student. The blackboard still glowed, but the words, "Welcome, new student," had faded, replaced by a series of abstract symbols that pulsed rhythmically. The air remained heavy, charged with an unseen energy. Ethan, pressed against the back wall, felt like an intruder at a sacred, or perhaps infernal, ceremony. He was still locked in, the door resolutely absent, but his immediate danger seemed to have shifted. He was no longer the sole, terrified focus. He observed the figure with an almost morbid fascination. It seemed to be taking notes, its movements precise and deliberate, as if engaged in a vital academic pursuit. What was it learning? What was this lesson about? The history of Turlock? Advanced calculus? Or something far more profound and terrifying? The questions swirled in Ethan's mind, but he had no way to ask them. Then he heard a faint, rustling sound from near the front of the room, near the blackboard. It was the sound of paper Ethan's eyes widened. He crept forward, cautiously, trying not to disturb the scene unfolding before him. He moved just enough to get a clearer view of the blackboard area. Attached to the blackboard, seemingly conjured from the very air, was a small, ornate scroll tied with a silken ribbon. Beside it, floating just above the surface, was an inkwell and a quill pen. As Ethan watched, mesmerized, the shadowy student reached out, its non-corporeal hand picking up the quill. It dipped the pen into the inkwell, and then, with deliberate strokes, began to write on the scroll. The light of the blackboard illuminated the writing. Ethan strained to read it, his heart pounding. It was a list of names. He recognized some of them from the yearbook, the ones with the missing faces. And then his breath hitched. At the very bottom of the list, written in that unmistakable cursive, was his own name, Ethan Miller. It was already there, pre-written, before he'd even been called upon. The shadowy student's quill hovered over his name, as if preparing to mark him. The sight of his name on the illuminated scroll, the shadowy student's quill poised above it, sent a fresh wave of terror through Ethan. He was not just a new student. He was about to be marked, perhaps permanently removed from existence. He flattened himself against the back wall, trying to disappear into the shadows, but he knew it was futile. The room was aware of him. The shadowy student paused, the quill suspended mid-air. A subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere, a heightened tension that even Ethan could feel. It was as if the room itself was assessing the situation, evaluating the best course of action. The hum intensified, a low thrumming that vibrated through Ethan's bones. Then, the blackboard's glow flickered, and the scroll with the names on it vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The empty space where it had been seemed to ripple, and in its place, a single, formidable test paper materialized, floating at eye level. It was larger than the previous one, its edges sharp and defined,
The title, written in bold, imposing letters, read, Midterm Examination. Ethan stared at the exam, his mind reeling. This was no longer instruction.
This was assessment, and the stakes were terrifyingly high. He looked at the shadowy student, who now turned its luminescent head towards him, its face still indistinct, but its focus undeniable. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The exam paper began to glow, a harsh, white light emanating from its surface. Ethan felt a strange sensation, as if the room was trying to pull him closer, to draw him into the sphere of the exam. He resisted, digging his heels into the dusty floor, his back pressed hard against the cold cinder block wall. Suddenly, a single question appeared on the exam paper, blazing with intensity. What is the true nature of temporal displacement? Beneath it, a single blank line appeared, stretching across the page, waiting for an answer. Ethan's mind was blank, a chaotic jumble of fear and confusion. He had no idea how to answer, no understanding of temporal displacement beyond a vague sense of things being out of place. He looked at the shadowy student. It was now facing him directly, its posture expectant. The room seemed to vibrate with an unseen force, pulling and pushing between them. It was clear this was not a test for both of them, or for him alone. The room, in its ancient, unfathomable wisdom, had decided it was a test to determine who was worthy, who truly belonged, and it looked like only one of them would be leaving. The blinding light of the midterm exam seemed to momentarily engulf the room, stretching the perception of time to an agonizing crawl. Ethan felt an invisible pressure, a force attempting to pull him towards the glowing paper, to complete the impossible question. He scrabbled against the wall, his fingernails scraping at the unyielding cinder blocks, his body screaming with the primal instinct of self-preservation. The shadowy student, who had been calmly observing, now made a subtle movement. It raised a hand, not towards Ethan, but towards the exam paper itself. As it did, the harsh white light of the question softened, then coalesced, forming a single, new line of text beneath the query. It read, One student remains. Attendance complete. Ethan watched, breathless, as the shadowy student then turned its luminescent gaze directly upon him. There was no malice, no anger, only an ancient, profound sense of finality. The room subtly shifted again, and Ethan felt a distinct loosening of the pressure on him. The force that had been pulling him towards the exam paper now receded, leaving him feeling suddenly irrelevant. He looked at the exam paper, then back at the shadowy student, who was now slowly fading, its form dissolving back into the shadows from which it had emerged. The hum of the room softened, a final, drawn-out sigh. The blackboard's glow extinguished, leaving the room in a dim, dusty twilight once more. Ethan took tentative steps forward. The exam paper was still there, but the question had vanished, replaced by a single, embossed seal. It looked like the crest he had seen on the yearbook, the owl with the quill. And beneath it, in elegant, flowing script, were the words, "Graduation awarded." He looked around room 4B, the desks seeming to sag with a weary finality. The cold had receded to a mere chill, a lingering memory of its oppressive presence. He was still trapped, the door still firmly sealed to the library. But the immediate threat, the terrifying scrutiny of the midterm, had passed him by. He was no longer the intended recipient of its judgment. As he stood there, a strange sense of emptiness washed over him. He had survived, it seemed. He hadn't been chosen, hadn't been erased, hadn't been marked complete, but he was still here, locked in a forgotten classroom that held secrets far beyond his comprehension. He looked at the embossed seal on the exam paper, at the words, "Graduation awarded." What had he graduated from? And more importantly, with the shadowy student gone and this impossible room still his prison, when would his own real lesson truly begin?